Good morning. Are you doing okay, Donald? Good. Um, I'm doing pretty good for a fellow that's been up since 3:30. Well, sometimes you get up because you need to, and sometimes you get up because you have to. It was the latter for me today. I just woke up. Have a lot on my mind on Sundays. Pardon? Yep, a lot of them on my mind. Good morning, all. I do have a study sheet available for our lesson in the back. We won't necessarily be covering it in class. But again, this is kind of, I'm using Gordon Fee's commentary on 1 Corinthians. And so each week in our lesson, I give you kind of a running summary, at least from Fee's perspective. And that is available for you. We are in 1 Corinthians 11. We discussed some of it last week. I think it might be good for us today just to do a little reading and to comment on what's going on. We'll begin at 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings just as I pass them on to you. So Paul praises them for what he can praise them for. Last week we spoke, this is kind of like a love sandwich where you praise them before you get on to them. And he's going to kind of get on to them in this chapter, first part of this chapter, and then he's going to really get on to them. But he says basically, the verse before that, follow my example even as I follow the example of Christ. And that's kind of what he has in mind, I think, when he thinks about praising them. Then he gets into the meat of the matter. He has an argument here that deals with culture and shame regarding his subject matter. Now, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with the head covered dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved, for a woman does not cover her head. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved off, she should cover her head. And so this is kind of an argument from culture and shame in that regard. As we're looking at this is a difficult passage to interpret for any number of reasons. Number one question that we need to ask, is he dealing with culture in a specific setting that does not apply to us today? That's the first question. Is this a cultural matter that does not apply to churches today? And truthfully, that's the way most treat it. Most scholars, most people. Occasionally you'll find a pocket of Christ followers who will, the ladies will come in, they will be wearing doilies. Like I said, in my home congregation, I didn't see it in the 50s, but it was established in the 50s, and in the 60s it was quite common to see women wearing hats, and that was kind of as a part of that. Secondly, or is this transcultural, which means Paul intended it to occur in every congregation, everywhere, all the time, regardless of the culture. And I think that's important to understand too. And the reason this is an interesting topic is because it opens up the question, are there some commands in the Bible that are culturally based and therefore are not applicable today? What say you about that? Yes, sir.
When I was a kid, a long time ago, most women would go to church with their hat on.
Most women would go to church with their hat on. What do you think about that? Do you think there are some commands in the Bible that are culturally based? What? Well, yeah. All right. This is one passage that we usually treat that way. It's culturally based. None of you ladies, I see, are wearing a hat today. Some of you have short hairstyles. Some of you have longer hairstyles. Occasionally, you'll see a woman that's in a little, what I used to call a pixie cut, where it's very close. In today's environment, it's not uncommon to see women who have shaved their head. So I haven't seen anyone in church that way. But again, that's an issue. So obviously, we treat this culturally. What about slavery? Paul gives commands to masters and slaves. Do you think that Paul is commanding slavery in society today, or are the commands that he gives culturally based? Culturally based. We normally think of it that way. That maybe he even planted the seeds in what he said and taught for the eventual overturning of that. All right, so let me get really controversial with you. All right, the Bible tells women to submit to their husbands. Is this something that is culturally based? In other words, because that was a society where women were more subject to their husbands? Or is that transcultural for us today? Is that something that should be applied in every church or in every marriage? Okay, and that is, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat. Katie says she believes that God put man over woman, and so that is something that if you love your husband, you're going to do, is what you said. And that is the argument for one of those things. Usually they go back to Genesis. Sometimes we even look here in 1 Corinthians 11 with some of the things Paul says here. Well, let me take it one more step controversially. Paul says that women were not to usurp authority over men, nor were they to teach. And that's the word that he uses what is that? First, wow, my mind. That's what he says in 1 Timothy 2. So, is that transcultural? Is that to be for all cultures, for churches in every age at any time? Or was that something that was based on a society where women tended to be looked down upon? Does that mean that the lack of educational opportunities women had at that time, the lack of theological opportunities that women had to teach? Or maybe that had to do something to do with what was going on in Ephesus and the temple of Diana, who was known to be very much of a matriarchal kind of relationship, where that was a situation, as is sometimes put forward in those situations. So I guess the question is, where do we stop this application? If something is culturally bound in one passage, what makes us think that there may not be other passages of Scripture or commands that are more culturally bound and not transcultural, that is, applying to all people for all ages? Anyone want to help me there? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So Katie says it's context. You need to evaluate some of these settings, not only in the context of what's going on, say, at Ephesus, or in this case at Corinth, but in the context of the whole Bible, maybe what God has said in other places in the Bible. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. But you understand, this is kind of a difficult knot to untie if you begin this thought that there are some commands that are culturally based. And this isn't the first time that Paul says something here. What Paul has to say about marriage over in chapter 7 was also based on what was going on at the time. And he says, at this time, I recommend that you don't get married. And so he had advice. He made very clear that some of the things that he was saying came from the Lord, and some of the things he was saying was his own apostolic judgment. But still, that in some way was a contextually bound, if not culturally bound, situation. So that is one of the little thorny issues that we find in this passage. Is this transcultural, or is this something that has limited the culture in which Paul is living? And I believe, and I would say most scholars that write on this believe, this was limited to Paul's culture at this time. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure where it is. You probably know. There is a passage that says women should keep silent in the congregation.
Yes, that's 1 Corinthians 14, and we will look at that. Not only in this class, but in the one that you're in on Wednesday night, on the role of women. We will look at that in depth when it comes to this. So that's the first thing that we need to look at in this. Is this culturally bound, or is it transcultural, and how it affects? The next thing that we need to look at, and I'll just try to take these in order, is this idea. Now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, this word head is important also for this discussion, for what it is saying regarding the reason that Paul commands what he commands. Now, the word head in the Greek is the word kephale. Kephale. It has a literal meaning. What is the literal meaning? You're noggin. Yeah, it has a literal meaning of head. Okay? So when the word kephale is used, it could refer to somebody's head. But it also has symbolic meaning. First symbolic meaning of head is that of source. And that's what many people believe head means in this passage. Source. Have you heard of the head of a river? What do you mean when you speak of the head of the river? Okay, that's right, where everything starts. It is the source. And one of the questions that when we're dealing with the role of women, when we're dealing with whether wives should submit to their husbands, when we're dealing with what Paul has to say in reflection of Genesis, we need to ask the question, does it mean source? Now, is it true that Christ in creation was the source of males? Because who was made first? Man. Christ is an agent in creation. He made males. Okay? All right. Is it true that man, human beings, males, are the source of women? Is that true from a creation standpoint? Yes, because she was created from him, from his side. Sometimes we say rib, but it means side. Could have been some meat there too. It's made from his side. So she came from man. And in his fleshly form, God was the source of Christ. Because Mary was overshadowed, I think is the word that is used, by the Holy Spirit, and she conceived, and her son was Jesus. So this is a combination of the working of God and the genetics of Mary produced Jesus. So, and Paul makes this argument, and he's even going to talk even more fully down here below that they are the source. What is a second interpretation of the word head? Metaphorical interpretation of the word head. The one in charge. Our minds go to a organizational chart, right? And you got all the flunkies down here at the bottom, right? And then you go up one step and you have your managers. You can go up one step and you keep going up. And usually there's what? One dude at the top somewhere. Or dudette, in this case. I don't want to be sexist. One lady. But there's somebody in charge. And we think of it in terms of head. As in some sort of hierarchical order. And some people have looked at this passage and they have said, well, that's what it means. Sometimes when we talk about Jesus being the head of the body, I mean, that kind of refers both in a literal, with the noggin, but also a figurative sense. And we normally treat that as being what? Pardon? Authority, Jesus being in charge of the church. Now let's go back and let's look at that thought and let's think as to whether or not in that context source could also apply. Is Jesus the source of the church? He is the source of the church in the sense that it was His blood that saved her, His activity that created her. And even in a passage that deals very heavily on the idea of Jesus being, husbands being head of the wife and Jesus being head of the church, which is Ephesians 5, he even goes on to say that husbands should be like Jesus and nourish and cherish our wives. He says Jesus has presented the church, or will present the church, as a bride spotless before God. So do you see how the meaning of head and source could be almost interchangeable in some context? So the way you interpret what he is saying here will give you an idea or will inform your interpretation of why he's saying that women must have their head covers. And here's what I mean. Is he saying, and here are some reasons that it's mentioned that women. Number one, women should have their head covered because the husband is the head of the wife, or the man, woman proceeded from man, and therefore there is this authority that man has, that if women do something like pray or prophesy and worship, they must do something that would show their submission to their head. Okay? And that's what I would say much of our interpretation has been through the years of this passage. A second possibility as to why he says what he says is that since woman proceeded from man, what she does, how she presents herself, how she looks, reflects back on the man, and therefore, in a sense of propriety, she should cover her head. And it has to do with propriety rather than authority and submission. And a third view, and this came from Keener. Ted, you remember we studied Keener's book when we were studying some of these issues. Keener believed that there were some uppity rich women in the church that were basically coming with all these fancy new hairstyles in church. And they were drawing undue attention to themselves, perhaps to the embarrassment of the men or to the embarrassment of their husbands. And so Paul is saying these things in order to correct that situation of what we would call propriety or immodesty. So those are three ways this particular passage has been interpreted through the years. Do you have any thoughts? Yes, sir, go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. I understand that. I'm simply, though, in this context, talking about the various different views that how this has been interpreted, and it's going to affect where you come out at the end. You understand? It is a foundational passage with how you deal with the role of women in the church. It is a foundational passage when it comes to looking at whether or not this is transcultural or not. So it's important that we kind of know how it's been interpreted. You would imagine that egalitarians or those that promote a more active role of women in the church would think that this does not have to do with authority or hierarchy, but more propriety. You can see how they would interpret the passage that way. You can see how those that are taking, I would say, making a strong argument or taking a hardline view on the submission of women would look at head as being authoritative, or look at this passage as being women who were acting in an authoritative way, but they had to show due respect to the men or to their husbands by covering their head. And that's kind of where we have gone in our fellowship with that. Go ahead.
Specifically, when you say cover your head, does that entail an actual piece of cloth
Okay.
to cover your head?
I think that's a wonderful question, which leads me to the third reason This is a difficult text to interpret. What kind of head covering is he talking about? Is he talking about one of these prayer shawls that the women would put up over their head when they were praying or prophesying? Is he talking about the thing that we have seen in some conservative churches of Christ where they wear a little doily over their head? And the picture, I think I have, I guess those are Mennonite girls that have the little cap on, and you know, is that kind of what he's talking about, or is he talking about long hair? Because he talks about women wearing long hair. Is that what he's talking about that women should do? They should have long hair. And there's one more, Harold. And the third, is he talking about, and this is almost right the opposite, is he talking about women who have long hair should wear their hair put up on her head or tied back for the sake of modesty or propriety? All right, so those are the three views of what it means to have your head covered in this passage. Does it mean you wear a veil? Does it mean you have long hair? Or does it mean that you put your hair on top of your head? All right, Harold.
Mostly what it means is moderation. And how everybody has their own interpretation, basically. And if they're talking to people in the church, you're supposed to be guided by the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
We should know what's moderate and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
If it's causing a problem, it's the obvious.
Harold said, and it sounds like you're taking kind of a proper view, what it means for a woman to dress properly. And so moderation needs to be what's going on, not weaving jewelry or such through the hair as perhaps was the case in some cases. That sounds like Keener's view about maybe the rich women greatly adorning their hair before they came to church. Let me mention there is one more possible problem, and this is the one that, if you read your study sheet, that Fee mentions. Another problem, he suggests that God had established differences between the sexes. God established differences between the sexes. Now that sometimes culturally will work its way out in different ways. For example, if you think of short hair, what do you normally think of? Men. You think of long hair, you normally think of women, right? But in the 60s and the 70s, the men started growing their hair out long, right? And didn't you hear I was watching a program the other day that went all the way back to the early 70s. I think it was a Columbo. Tina and I have gotten into watching some of the old Columbo shows from the past. But they actually mentioned someone being effeminate, a man who wore long hair. So in our culture, that was once the case as well, right? That distinction, and I remember churches even preaching that distinction as being a violation, or wearing long hair was a violation of that distinction that God had placed between the sexes. Go ahead. That's right. And again, that kind of points to the cultural nature of different mores in a community regarding the distinctions between men and women. Last week we talked about pantsuits. Remember that? How many of you in here remember the great pantsuit controversy of the 60s and 70s? All right, we got a few. All right. Ever heard a minister preach that women should not wear pantsuits? They even go to the Old Testament. It says women should not wear the clothes of men and men should not wear the clothes of women. Somebody Yeah, I heard somebody talking last week, and they said something about that. I would not wear. The woman was wearing pants. She said, "I would not, as a man, wear the pants that you're wearing." And that's kind of the case. Who was it up here first? Yeah, Harold. What did you have?
But we also have this, a lot of people don't have the same opinion and they have practices that are different.
Mm-hmm.
And if you convert them, a lot of times you can't force on them. You can't do it out of love. And basically, if our tradition is causing a problem,
Mm-hmm.
then we don't have that tradition.
Okay. All right. Back here. I think that it is culturally based. And I think there have been times throughout history, and I think that's the point that Fee is making, is that God here is saying there is a distinction between the sexes. And by the way, Fee wrote this commentary. He first wrote it back in the 80s. He revised it in the early aughts. And I'm not saying it was before something like transgenderism or transgender thought was there, but it's not like he's writing this today when it's just right there in your face. He said he believed that this chapter had to do with maintaining the distinctions between the sexes, and it was culturally based, and in this day it had to do with long hair. And Fee believes, I think, the covering was long hair, and he said, and man should wear short hair, according to the culture of his day. Yes, Katie. I want to say this and try to say this very carefully. I heard someone who came to this church say these words. This is the first church I ever felt welcome in. That was the words they said. First church I ever felt welcome in. And I asked the follow-up question, why? And they said, it's because I have tattoos. And people have often ostracized me or talked about me because I have tattoos. I have tattoos. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Um, well, I won't comment any more on all of that. But yes, you're right, Katie. We have to be careful how we receive people. And I think that is vital, especially us as a church, that we do that. So, these are some of the hard points of this. Go ahead.
Well, yes, and I've read this over and over and over again, and I think I violate a few of those. But, if you address it in the concept that the Lord is telling Paul, okay, I don't want to see a man, say, sitting in the front with long hair, dressed in maybe not quite sure of him being a woman or a man from the back,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And he is sitting there. Or as a woman with her hair cut as a man, okay, in the form and dressed in, I don't know, some kind of shirt
Mm-hmm.
that could be a female or a man.
That might have been the reason Paul wrote what he wrote.
In other words, the addressing of what you look like
Yes.
as a person and identifying that as your example for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And
That.
I know that sounds like, okay, I'm sitting on the fence because, well, if I like
Well, now understand, if Paul is saying this, that there must be some sort of, we must maintain difference between the sexes. He is using this as an example in the custom of his day. And I do not believe it is transcultural. I think the principle of maintaining differences between the sexes, I think that is a transcultural particular thing. But I don't think necessarily the short hair, long hair is part of that here. He even finishes this, and he basically says, okay, this is a custom, all right? This is the way I prefer it. This is the way we do it in the churches where I work. But he basically tells us, and by the way, in answering that question of whether or not something is cultural or transcultural, if you have the author saying, okay, this is my opinion, this is what I teach, this is what I think you should practice, it most likely is not transcultural. Go ahead. I have one book, and I may show my class on Wednesday night. This author he was saying that women with long hair, at least in this culture, letting the hair hang down, would be inappropriate because it made her sexually desirable. It would be. Oh, the men usually short, shut or shorn. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking about Rome, but if you look at some of the statues, and that's what this guy does. He shows statues. I think he's just showing statues of women. How the statues, how their hair was cut. It was usually short for the men, but the women was on top of their head. And so a lot of people think that really is what Paul was saying, is that in order to be less seductive, especially in church, a woman should wear her hair on top of her head. So there you go. We know even in some of our songs, things like "Let Your Hair Down" or whatever is almost sexual innuendo. You know, she took her hair down, or that kind of thing. Yes, sir. And we'll get to enjoy that for at least 4 years, won't we? Go ahead.
it gets very difficult if you don't, when you get into the specifics of what was Paul's concept
Mm-hmm.
and what was God.
Yeah.
Because when you're dealing with an intelligent person who says that's one of the contradictional points in
Mm-hmm.
the Bible, it gets very difficult. But I was in Africa some years ago, and we were in the Sahara Desert. And the Berbers, which is a race that is nomad, camel type race, came into the city. And if they saw a woman with anything above her knees showing,
Mm-hmm.
they would literally take a stick and wallop.
Oh my.
That was their tradition because women were not allowed to show ankles.
Ah. All right.
So,
And you said where? Kenya?
no, this was in Sierra, at the border of the Sierra.
Oh, okay.
In Morocco, but at the border.
Okay.
Okay? And
Okay. Well, it's obvious, especially those of us that have now a more wide view of different cultures. Uh, we understand that there are a lot of cultural practices that are different in America versus other places in the country. And some of these, perhaps not walloping people, but some of these, it might not be bad if we went back to, right? Let's look at verse 7 so we can finish the chapter. A man ought not cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. Again, that has to do with being created by God, right? God being the source. But the woman is the glory of the man. And why would she be the glory of the man? Because she was made from man, right? What was the very first thing that Adam said when he saw Eve? He said, "Wow," is what he said. He said, "Wow." He burst out into song. He says, "At last, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." So woman is the glory of man. Neither was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this reason, and because of the angels, and we got into that a little bit last week, and I'm not going to get back into it today, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. Now, look, that's where many take the idea that in order for a woman to pray or prophesy in the church, she must show due authority to her husband or to man in some way. How that would work out today in our culture, I don't know. In Paul's day, it was probably putting the hair up on top of your head to show. Another way of looking at the sign of authority is that, let's just go on. Verse 11. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. Now, this is really interesting because he brings up some passages from Genesis that deal with order of creation and such as that. And then he talks about how women and men are independent of each other. And I would think the idea there is independent and equal. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from men, also men are born of woman. So, he's saying there is this interdependence there that it's important for us to realize. So even though on one hand he says a woman owes man certain kind of respect, should not shame him by the way her hair or head is covered or uncovered in worship. But then he goes on to say that we're talking about an interdependence with one another here. Go ahead. It's a good question. That's another question for interpretation. Is he talking about married couples, or he's talking about women being submissive to all men with the head covering? Mm-hmm.
And there was no thought of her going out, getting a college education, living on her own, getting a job. That just wasn't in their realm of men and women's roles.
Yeah, understood. I'm sorry, I had a comment to that, but it's gone now. Verse 13. Judge for yourself, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Again, what that means? Does the very nature of thing teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? That almost makes it sound like he's talking about long hair as the covering, does it not? But that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For long hair is given to her as a covering, So I've heard a lot of people get to this point in the passage and they say, well, it's the long hair that we're talking about. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. And the idea is tradition and custom. This is our custom. This is the way we do things. So there we go. Anyone want to put any punctuation on this? It's time for us to stop. Yes, sir.
Well, it does. If the woman doesn't do this, it's great. Get shame.
Well, he's not talking about forcibly taking the women out to the parking lot and shearing them there in front of everybody. But he's saying that we're talking about shame here. If a woman is not following the propriety of the day, if she is not conforming to the mores of culture, in this particular case, she might as well just go ahead and shave her head off. And of course, that would be considered horrible, to have your head shaved. And that's kind of what he's saying there. Yeah. Yeah, and it could be that he's talking about submission here. Very good. Anybody else? Well, I hope that in this very, very difficult to translate passage, I have tried to give you in a broad way what the various interpretations are, because they are many in this particular case. And of course, we don't have time to discuss this. If this really is a culturally based matter, then really, other than its import and how we interpret, other than the import and how we interpret other passages, this does not apply to us, or does it? We'll look at the second half of chapter 11 next week.